So welcome to another one of our Thriving at Work webinars. My name is Julie Highfield. I'm the director of the Wellbeing project with the Intensive Care Society. And today's webinar is on the subject of suicide and how to respond and care for your team. If we could have the next slide, please. I think it's important to, of course, note that the nation is in mourning. I'm just going to read out this statement. It's with great sadness that we learn of the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Her unparalleled reign stood as the one constant for the British people and those across the Commonwealth and beyond for 70 years. Her unfaltering support for the NHS has been felt by all working within it and is testament to her dedication to public service. Her legacy will last forever, and our deepest condolences are with her family during this difficult time. And that's a message from Dr. Stephen Webb, our president, and Dr. Sandy Mather, our chief exec. So we considered this event today in light of Her Majesty the Queen's passing, and if we should postpone it. But this webinar explores our reactions in response to unexpected deaths. And actually, we're very aware right now, with the nation in mourning, that the passing of Her Majesty has triggered many of our past bereavements, and we are all reacting. So we actually thought this webinar is quite timely and might offer a secondary supportive message to our intensive care community. So I hope you agree with us that it was timely, appropriate and supportive to continue. Thank you. Next slide. So today you'll obviously hear from me, as well as being the project director for the Intensive Care Society. My background is that I'm a consultant clinical psychologist in intensive care based in South Wales. Emma Swingwood has shared her story with us today, and you'll be hearing from her. She's the Respiratory Pathway Lead Physio and Clinical Doctoral Research Fellow in UHB and Western NHS Trust. And you'll also hear the personal story of Dr. Sarah Thornton, whose background is she's a consultant in critical care and anaesthesia for Thornton NHS Trust. Next slide, please. So our agenda is that we'll be talking through unexpected death of a colleague first aid kit, and we'll be thinking about and reflecting on the loss of our colleagues through death, through suicide. And Emma and Sarah will be sharing their stories. This is obviously a very difficult subject, but I think you'll join me in also enjoying Emma's and Sarah's reflections on celebrating their colleagues as well. But we'll be reflecting on what our colleagues need. And towards the end, we'll have an opportunity for any questions with myself and Emma. So could I please ask that if you wish to ask questions, that you wait until the end, or if a question pops up for you, that you use the Q&A function rather than any chat function, as that will help the flow of the slides. Next slide, please. So the first aid kit, which we will launch on Monday, the unexpected death of a colleague, actually started as a suicide first aid kit in response to the sad news of trainee doctor suicides late last year. It led to me forming a trainee doctor wellbeing project as a sub-project of the Thriving at Work series and a group of trainee doctors, I'll go through the list of them in the next couple of slides, joined with me to think specifically about trainee doctor needs, but we took on this project. It's worth knowing that despite it being trainee doctor led, actually the project relates to all professions, clinical and non-clinical, in intensive care and beyond. Through the last 9 months of working through this project, I've also been speaking to experts by experience, and they have widened our scope and enabled us to really think about what staff need. And two of them have very kindly shared their story with me. And it's in those conversations that we actually considered that any unexpected death is triggering. Any unexpected death of a colleague requires help and support. And sadly, in the case of suicide, we don't often know that the reason is suicide within the first 24 or 48 hours. So what we didn't want to do is that people wouldn't use the first aid kit because they didn't think it was relevant. So we widened it. And I also give my absolute thanks to the family of Ben, who have reviewed this document and have given their thoughts about how to relate to the family during this time. And we dedicate the document to the memory of Ben. Next slide. So here's a lovely list of fabulous people who've collaborated with this. So many thanks to Stuart, Kat, Emma, Ken, and then Emma Plunkett, Emma Swingwood, 3 Emmas in a document, and Sarah Thornton and Rob and Marjorie, Ben's parents, have all contributed to the first aid kit, and we'll be launching it on Monday. And the point of the first aid kit is in no way to repeat the work of many different associations and many different areas in this work. Specifically, the Association of Anaesthetists have done incredible work in this area. But we reflected through our own personal experience when I was approached in response to a colleague's suicide, that often you feel like a rabbit in the headlights, and you cannot search through Google and links to find what you need. So what we wanted was the idea of a first aid kit is something where you pull it off the shelf and it links you to all those wonderful links and documents and guidance that are out there. But it also gives you 10 really key actions. Within our document, we've also talked about some preventative work as well. So next slide, please. So just to acknowledge those key sources, if you haven't read the guidance from the Association of Anaesthetists, I really encourage you to do so. Particular thanks to our colleagues in the association and in FICM for collaborating with us in this project. There's also wider NHS documents that are out there about crisis management and what we call post-vention. So it's the intervention in the aftermath of a suicide or a sudden death. So we've drawn from these great documents and we hyperlink to all of them in our very shortened first aid kit. Next slide, please. So an important question to ask, I am by no means an expert in this area, but are healthcare staff at higher risk of suicide? So the best place to look for statistics is the Office of National Statistics, who regularly update their statistics on suicide. This is specifically in England, and the latest data is England 2011 to 2015, if you could click on. So we do know that very sadly, suicide is the leading cause of death for adults under 50 in England. Something to really kind of take a moment to notice that when it comes to healthcare professionals, actually, it is female healthcare professionals that push the risk up. So particularly female nurses and female doctors and male paramedics is what pushes the statistical risk higher for healthcare professionals. And click on. We do know that actually those who have been affected by a recent suicide are actually at greater risk of a suicide attempt themselves. So that immediate aftermath is particularly triggering, but it's also particularly triggering for mental health and psychological well-being. Click on. We particularly know a factor in the risk for doctors, dentists, nurses, and vets also in particular at increased risk because of access to and knowledge of a method of suicide. It's a particular one. And next one. And of course, mental health is a mediating factor by occupation, and that's specifically for doctors. And we can speculate that may be about some of the stigma that's attached to asking for help, acknowledging your own health needs, mental health and wider. We hope that over the last few years, if we've learnt nothing else, we've learnt to be open and honest in our vulnerability. So we hope that over time that may change. And next slide. And a question, of course, is can we be preventative and can we have a psychologically informed environment? Well, we talk about this in the first aid kit, but a few key factors is the more we talk, the better it is about everything in work. The more we talk about mental health, but the more we just meet as colleagues. We meet in meetings, but we also meet socially. We meet in the coffee room. The more we know each other, the more we might spot each other's needs, but certainly the more that people will feel less socially isolated. Obviously, it's important that actually we gain some professional training within that. And I urge you to go to our society website where we have lots of ongoing well-being training that's available to our intensive care society members and beyond. Of course, it goes without saying, our wellbeing project is called Thriving at Work. We do have to think about working conditions, and we do have to think about reasonable demands and access to the right kind of resources to do the job well. We also know that a strong peer support system can help people's mental health and help the sense of community and culture in intensive care. Also urge you, if you wish to sign up for our programme, and that you can do. And of course, as a professional psychologist, it's very important that people have access to professionals such as myself, occupational health, wellbeing services. And we need to pay attention, particular attention to the new ones, the junior staff and the rotating staff across all the professions. It's these people who may not yet have made those social connections at work that can hide in the shadows. So those are our thoughts on being preventative. Next slide, please. So what we're now going to do is share two videos from Emma and from Sarah about their experiences. Okay. So thanks, Emma, for joining me today. For the audience, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what your role is?
So my name is Emma Swingwood. I'm a respiratory physio by background and I've been a respiratory physio for many years. So I'm so lucky that I've had the opportunity to work in different trusts and across lots of different areas of respiratory, but currently I'm based in Bristol. So my job title is very random. It's a respiratory pathway lead. So in essence, I just get to work across respiratory, working with a number of teams, working clinically, some managerial responsibilities, and get to see all the really juicy, exciting patients. That's me in a nutshell.
Fabulous. Thanks, Emma. And thank you for agreeing to talk to me today. So I know, and we won't go into details, but I know that you've had some personal experience at work of the loss of a colleague through suicide. And I've brought you here today to kind of reflect on the tool that we've pulled together to try to help services respond to staff needs after that. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to go through some of your reflections, if that's okay. So Emma, if you cast your mind back and you think about the sort of hours and days after you found that a colleague of yours had passed away through suicide, do you remember back your original emotional reactions and what you did?
I think initially, it's kind of almost like blankness and disbelief. And I think I'm normally a really optimistic person, maybe sometimes a little too optimistic. So I think in my head, we'd be like, okay, tomorrow everything will be okay. Because that's my normal, I'll be like, no, it's fine. It'll be tricky, but it'll be fine. And obviously it wasn't fine. And I was like, when you find out, you're like, there is no going back from this actually, that this isn't going to be okay. And it is okay now, but at the time it was obviously fairly hideous. So it was just blankness, kind of like, oh, okay, with the realization, and a lot of disbelief actually, and almost trying to, I don't know, as a clinician, I think it's irrelevant what profession you are. You are presented with a patient and you're trying to understand and work out what's wrong, and most of the time you have an answer. So I think to some extent, a lot of us were also trying to do that and put things into place. But obviously, we only have one part of the story, and that's our viewpoint. And we didn't have many more other points of view, so that we never were able to finish the jigsaw puzzle and to understand. And that's something that we never will understand. So that's still quite challenging, because you can't. I don't know. I think you don't understand how suicide could be the better option. But obviously I'm saying that from a very logical position, and when somebody's in that position, they're not necessarily thinking logically at all. So you can't apply logic to an illogic situation. So it's just baffling, I think. But then at the same time, you're expected to carry on and work because you need to, because the beds are full of patients. So there was a lot, I think mixed emotions, maybe that's a better way, and almost depending on which hat you had and where you were, enabled you to feel slightly differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And you referred there a little bit to your colleagues' reactions and you as a collective trying to make sense of this, which is, not a surprise. I think it's quite understandable. What were the other reactions of your colleagues? And in particular, were there any reactions that surprised you or surprised others?
I mean, there was... So almost from the close team who worked with our colleague on a day-to-day basis, even that was mixed reactions. Some people were obviously very upset and understandably very upset. Some people were just exceptionally quiet. Again, that's their coping strategy and that's fine. But that was not interesting to watch, that's different, but that was quite a learning point for me, because I was like, ooh, okay, one strategy to support this team isn't going to work. We need lots of strategies. But then also obviously the indirect team, because our colleague had worked in the trust for a number of years, and so obviously being a team lead in a team that then has rotational staff, being in the changing room for over years, your face is known, isn't it? So from the wider department, really, and the multidisciplinary team that she worked with, again, that was really mixed. And I think that those mixed reactions, I found it interesting how then the direct team perceived those. Sometimes it was almost like, well, why are they so upset? They didn't work with her. And that, for me, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Wasn't expecting that. Didn't realise we were going to judge how other people reacted. But again, in a way, that's just a coping strategy for that person. But that was interesting. And I think that just every now and again, there was a comment, and a lot of comments were directed upwards. So I did get a lot of comments almost like, well, joking, obviously, what on earth have you been doing with your teams? I was like, I don't know. And I think it does make you go and question yourself. Well, hold on, what have I missed? Like, okay, actually, maybe that is a valid question. I joked it off at the time, but then it did kind of make me take a step back and go, actually, crikey, have I made an error here? And I know it, even deep down, I think I knew at the time I hadn't missed anything. This was a massive surprise to everybody, and like family included. But it does still make you second guess yourself. So I'd had a one-to-one on the Friday, and then this happened over initially it happened over the weekend, and then was found on like a few days later. And I had over that weekend gone through every single one-to-one notes that we'd ever had. But obviously I didn't find anything, but it kind of made me feel a little bit better. But I think people were doing slightly illogical things like that, but we kind of just let people do it because that's what they felt they needed to do. So again, mixed emotions and different levels of emotion, even whether they worked with somebody on a day-to-day basis or it was seeing the colleague from afar. It didn't seem, there was no pattern really.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say part of the support is just letting people go through that process of sense checking and wondering, could I have done something different? Is there something I didn't do, etc. It's a natural part of what we do. I think especially as healthcare professionals, as you said at the start, we want to understand that's our worlds. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking about, in the aftermath, how you and your team supported each other, what were the key things that you found helpful and others noted to be helpful?
I think this is quite tricky. If I'm honest, I don't know, and that seems a really silly answer, and it's not very helpful, is it? But I can't say this was the thing that helped me, if I'm honest. I think it was lovely how just supportive everybody was. That was insanely amazing. And almost people you just wouldn't, normally respiratory people are like, oh, I don't want to come to respiratory, but all of a sudden anybody was happy just to help with like caseloads and stuff, and that just gave people space if they needed it and allowed some flexibility. So that was amazing and just took the pressure off a little bit. In essence, really, the thing that's helped is time. Yeah. And that time period through to a funeral, that was just survival. If I'm not, it's a whirlwind, isn't it? You're still in an absolute brain fog. And almost once the funeral had happened, yes, that was a little bit of closure, and it did help not draw a line under it so we forgot at all, but it almost enabled us to turn a page and go, right, okay, this is us now. We now have to work our way through this and find our new normal, because that person isn't part of that anymore. And that was really hard, but we had to do it. And in a way, the beauty of being in healthcare is that there are always patients in the bed. So you don't have the opportunity of pausing a service for a few weeks, do you? You have to keep going. So in a way, maybe the fact that we had to have a routine, I think that maybe helped as well. And I think I guess maybe now I'm thinking of it, I do remember on one day we used to have we were in between moving offices, so we were in this site village, we called it, which in essence was some porta cabins. It's a snazzy name for some piles of porta cabins. But it was a very vast open space, and my desk was within that. And I remember just sitting there kind of thinking, oh, crikey, where do I find the glue to stick all this together? Like, where do you even start? And it was so lovely that somebody was like, no, but that's not your sole responsibility. And even that was just like, yeah, actually, no, you are right. I know these are my teams, and I did feel very responsible for them. I wanted to be able to help them and make things as easy as possible for them. But my colleague was totally right that wasn't my sole responsibility, and I didn't need to take that all on. I mean, I probably still did take quite a lot of it on, but that's fine. That's what I want. That was probably my coping strategy. So I think, lots of different things, and I think it was very clear that different things worked for different people in different ways. Yeah.
I mean, that's useful, isn't it? To say there's not one thing that would work for everyone across the board. It is also interesting to hear you talk about the funeral, as it's something that we have as part of our culture. However it sort of pans out, we have some kind of funeral, burial, cremation, whatever it is, and that's quite an important kind of milestone, kind of mark in time for what now.
Yeah.
So So I guess thinking back, it's probably hard to do. I hope you're never in that position again. But the tool that we pulled together is in essence a way of saying there's lots of really interesting, useful, valid reading and guidance out there. But when you're in the thick of the moment, you may not be able to put your hands on it. So the tool really is about summarising that in brief and giving just kind of 10 key potential actions. What do you think it would be like if you'd have had something like that tool available to you at the time?
I think it would have been really helpful, if I'm honest. I remember sitting at home trying to function as part of my family and almost try and leave work at home, which obviously I wasn't successful at all. It was truly hideous at doing that, but I think that's okay. But almost trying to watch TV and trying to Google, like, who is there to talk to? Who is the, what resources are out there? And I just couldn't find anything. And in a way, all I found was, horrific YouTube videos of almost how to, and I was like, that is definitely not what I'm looking for. So whether it's because I just wasn't able to search in a logical way, that could have been it. I have no idea what I put in yet. So almost having the access at hand to support networks, I think would have been invaluable, because then in a way people can access those a little bit more privately, because although any health referral counselling we had at work is obviously confidential, it still needed a referral. So actually you could never do it 100% privately, and it would be in work time. So again, it would never be somebody would still know you were there. So I think that would be really valuable. It's almost the expectations from people clearing out lockers, clearing out drawers, because we had to give it to establishments and stuff. But I think if people are in that situation, it isn't going into just going into all throttles head, almost just to make sure that we are frequently pausing and just considering what we're going to do next and the potential impact of those around, and then gradually do things rather than a bit gung-ho. And I felt that sometimes things were happening a little bit too quickly. And then almost once you've cleared a locker and once you've cleared the office, it's gone. And actually that wasn't necessarily the best thing at the time for the team. So it's just maybe trying as much as we can just to keep pausing, even if we do feel it's the best thing to do, just pause and just consider who else it might impact, I think, is my learning I took.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Emma, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Thanks for talking to us today. So, Sarah, thank you for joining me today to talk about death of colleagues. Can you just tell our audience a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your background, please?
So I'm an intensive care and anaesthetic consultant at Bolton, which is a big district general just outside of Manchester. I've been involved in education since I was a college tutor as a brand new consultant. So I've been a consultant for 22 years, college tutor for the first 6, and then training programme director, and then head of school of Manchester and Mersey for 8 years. So I am, and I'm now sitting on college council on the education and training and exams board. I've got a background in education, let's just say that. So I unfortunately, in my experience in the last few years, I have experienced a number of colleagues dying from suicide and also from fatigue. And so what I've found is it's something that needs paying close attention to. It's not something you can just pass. Let it pass. You need to actually support your staff and make sure that they are looked after, because it's very distressing for everybody when somebody dies. And actually there is a massive need for people to acknowledge and commemorate and celebrate a colleague's death and it needs to be looked at very, very carefully, because if it's dealt with in the wrong way, it can actually make the situation worse. So this toolkit looks to me like something that will, from my experience, has been is exactly what we've done, but actually there's some additional things there that help that would be useful for everyone.
Okay, thank you for that. So if you could just kind of reflect on the experiences you've had, and just for the audience to just share your first reactions that you felt yourself when you heard of colleagues passing away through suicide.
So one of the things that well, the first reaction I think everybody has is shock and horror and surprise that this has happened, and the initial disbelief that could be that person is no longer with us, and that I think that's a universal reaction to any death. But when it's suicide or fatigue or something preventable, there's another dimension to it that I think people find very difficult, because they feel immediately guilty and try and blame themselves and how could they have altered the trajectory of that doctor or that trainee or that consultant, and whether they could have done anything differently. And that certainly, as a responsible person responsible for someone's training, when Ben died, and I've talked to his family, and they're happy for us to talk about Ben, is I felt responsible. I was part of his training from a very young age, from as far as all of his ST training, and he was a lovely bloke, and I'd worked with him on a one-to-one basis at my hospital. So it was a personal reaction as well as a school reaction that I had, and I had two sides of my head. One of them going, "Oh my God, Ben's no longer here," and then the other side of my head going, right, I need to provide support for a lot of people. And as when it's a trainee, then you find that there are multiple places that they've been where they've had an impact, and people, you need to find the right people and make sure that they get the support they need. So it needs to be joined up. And that can be difficult when you're looking at an entire region and they've worked in multiple hospitals. So yes, so you have this personal shock and horror, but also as a doctor, you also have a kind of professional curiosity that which people feel uncomfortable expressing, but they want to know. And as I said to you earlier, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, because having information and understanding what happened and why these circumstances came about is really important for people to know, even though it's not always clear to start off with. So first of all, you need to provide the support and make sure people know where to come. But
so I completely agree with you about that curiosity, and I think sometimes people can think that that's the wrong reaction or an odd reaction. But as you say, especially for us as healthcare professionals, we make sense of things when we know why and we understand why. Don't we? So when you think about, you've supported a range of people within your own team and across a number of teams by the sounds of things, were there other reactions where people felt, I shouldn't react this way, or why are they reacting this way? Did you notice anything that perhaps surprised you?
So I was surprised by the breadth of how our trainees touch everybody's lives. So I think we tend to think as doctors that the people who will be grieving the most are other doctors, but actually, certainly in the most recent trainee death I've dealt with, he had an impact across the board, from the porters to, and I'm not sure, it was astonishing, the reaction that I had. And I think you need to be aware that if someone's worked in a particular environment, they've spoken to everybody, and everybody needs to be treated exactly the same, because they will all have a grief response. So that surprised me. Not that Joe, who's another trainee that I've dealt with, who, because he was a lovely bloke, and I'm not surprised everybody loved him, but it was the fact that the cleaner came up to me and said, "I'm so sad about Joe. He always said good morning to me. He always said hello. He was such a friendly and lovely bloke." And that kind of the way that people touch lives is always surprising, because you don't necessarily know that about him. If I wasn't on the corridor when he said hello to the cleaner, I wouldn't know that aspect of him. So you can never underestimate the impact that people have, and knowing that is hugely important, and recognizing that. The other thing that surprised me is everybody, the extent of the blame. So everybody has this reaction that they could have done something. If only I'd just phoned him or texted him or done something differently that would have changed it. And it's lovely that people think that they can influence these things, but I think the tendency to blame oneself, it seems to be fairly ingrained, particularly in doctors, I think, or healthcare professionals, not doctors, but healthcare professionals, is that we take responsibility for things as human beings, but also as professionals. And so we try to take responsibility for things that we have no control over. And part of dealing with that is acknowledging that they are not ignoring that. And it's really not important. It's important not to ignore people's self criticism, and to acknowledge that and say, actually, that you couldn't have done anything, because they will carry that with them as a blame thing, and it's part of the trauma, isn't it? It's part of the trauma that carries on after that person has gone. And they also, the other thing that has surprised me, but in a really positive way, is the need to commemorate. So, and the need to celebrate, and the need to make sure that that person is remembered. So the ways that we've done that as a school is, so I created a Just Giving page. We created a commemoration book that we passed all around in the department, and stayed in the department for a long time, so everybody could write in it. And the family have just come to collect that and written a beautiful card to say thank you for doing that. We, at the same time that the funeral was, we ran a parallel celebration in the workplace for those who couldn't get to the funeral because they were at work. Because the NHS needs to be manned, but you want to express yourself. So the Reverend came up and did a little, we did a minute's silence and lit a candle, and just acknowledged that a celebration of his life was going on at the same time. And actually people all brought in food food is a great level. Everybody brings in food. So we all brought in food and we had a buffet, and we put a picture of him with a candle burning next to it in the corner of the room, and people just, it was like it was there. So it's so important that not only do you acknowledge it, but you also commemorate it and celebrate that person's life. It doesn't matter how they lost their life. They're gone and they need to be celebrated. And
absolutely, I agree. As you're talking, actually, the things that are striking me as a psychologist are the things we see in any grief reaction. It's not just about suicide, it's any death. So coming back to that kind of questioning, and if only I could have, actually in classic kind of grief teaching, we talk about the bargaining side of kind of grief, and that kind of almost part of the adjustment and part of making sense of something is to work out, could it have been different? And you almost need to play out those scenarios in your mind until you let it settle. I think what's really lovely to hear is the importance of ritual as well. This is why we need memorials, funerals, headstones, those sorts of things. We need rituals as human beings, and it's a really important part that actually for people like Ben and Joe, they've touched so many lives. Everyone needs a part in that ritual, don't they? So
and what was the family found that enormously comforting, because they don't know that. They don't know how many lives that, because they're your child, but when they're a professional working at the NHS, you let your child go into work and you don't know who they interact with. And so having that positive reinforcement of what a massive impact they've had on other people's lives was of massive comfort to the family, and also to other people, because if you find other people are going through the same process as you, there's a comfort in that, isn't there? Is acknowledging that we all feel the same, and that you're not in isolation feeling sad. You're sat next to someone who's also feeling sad. And suicide in particular, people are reluctant to acknowledge that aspect because they feel there's still a stigma attached to it, isn't there? It's not beat about the bush. People feel that it is there's somehow a stigma attached to it, and that kind of stops people talking about it. And actually, the talking about it is the bit that stops the next suicide, because if there's someone in that room feeling hopeless and they hear people talking in a positive and supportive way about how they would like to have been able to help that person, and how they don't think anything bad about them having mental health issues, I think that makes all the difference. So this is not just about supporting people, it's about prevention, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's such an important point you're making there, isn't it? Because actually there are more people at risk in the shadows, potentially in the quiet, holding back. And actually, the more we can bring it into day-to-day discussion, actually, the more people might feel able to reach out and just make that connection and potentially prevent another suicide. I think you talk a lot about lots of the different things that were helpful at the time. It's really lovely to hear not just the kind of almost the things that help the negative reaction, but the things that enable a positive reaction as well. The point about it all is to really help people in those kind of first few days and weeks where maybe they're almost not quite sure how to react. And when you look at the tool now and you think about how you reacted at the time, what do you think it would be like if, heaven forbid, the next death of a colleague, but if you had that tool in front of you, how could it be helpful?
I think having a bit more joined up response is quite helpful. Certainly with, as I said before, when you've got a trainee, there's multiple different hospitals. And so having one thing that you suggested in that, and I ended up doing as head of school, is being the one point of contact. So I contacted his family and I then enabled a dialogue between themselves and what we were organising. So we did a number of different things as a school. So we had an anaesthetic ball coming up, and we did a raffle, and we donated the money from that raffle to him, and we acknowledged him, and we had a minute's silence at the ball, and all of those things. I made sure his family were aware were happening. I made sure that there needs to be somebody who talks to that family and makes sure that they're involved in the more global response to a trainee or a colleague's death, so that they because they're so much part of it, but often because it's a workplace and a family, they're not necessarily connected, and they need that thread between them of somebody who can provide that information and let them know what's going on, and they've been helpful. They've been really grateful for that connection. I think the main thing I want to say is that it's not to be afraid to talk about things, and if you have a colleague dies that you know really well, talk about it to your peers and your colleagues, and get involved in trying to, in the response, in trying to help others understand what's happened, and that in itself will help you. The whole of this toolkit is not just about supporting, it's about preventing, and we can all support each other to do that, and to make this less likely to happen in the future.
And that's a lovely comment. Thank you. Well, I think you'll agree that Emma and Sarah's story are both really powerful, and I'm sure many of the audience can relate to what was said. Just a couple more slides, and then Emma and I will respond to your questions. So just want to briefly point out this model of healthcare staff and grief that comes from Papadatu, who works in paediatric intensive care. And it's something I actually use a lot with families in ICU, but it's a useful thing for us to think about because it's based on how we as staff experience grief. And to just explain the diagram, we can feel ourselves both experiencing and avoiding grief in parallel. So rather than the Kubler-Ross kind of standard model of going through phases, we're both trying to keep going whilst holding our emotional response at the same time. So we zigzag between the two, and obviously our own personal experiences, as well as the work culture and assumptions and values about death, interact with that. And I just find that a really helpful model to help us understand why we're almost able to sort of shelve grief a lot of the time. Staff members that I've worked with that have had personal bereavements do find it harder to almost move through those tasks of grieving and enable themselves those emotions. Next slide, please. So let's think about how staff respond to colleague loss in particular. So Sarah and Emma said it all for us, so I'm just going to summarise, obviously, that initial shock and disbelief. Click on. There's obviously, for some, there can be a sense of anger, there's distress and sadness, but also you heard a lot about responsibility and guilt and feeling blame. Next ones. I think it's worth noting, especially as we're all as a nation mourning right now and feeling this in response to Her Majesty, we can displace that distress. When we think about everything that we've been through as a nation, actually we've been holding in that holding back, avoiding grief for so long, and the Queen's passing almost enables our distress. It gives us that conduit, and it can be the same through any loss. Next one. And of course, you heard about curiosity. It's a particular thing for everyone, but healthcare professionals need an answer. They need to know. So do not see that asking and that wondering why as a bad thing. It's actually quite an important part of what we do. And the next one. And of course, celebration. You know, in all of the negatives, we need that ritual. We need the positives. Next slide, please. So summarising the 10 points of what people need, if you could click through these, please. So as Sarah and Emma both took that position, you do need one central person or maybe a couple of central people to be the key leads for communications. It is important to answer to that curiosity and issue a statement as soon as possible, and working with management to do that may be the way forward. It's important to also think about, as Rob and Marjorie told us, that connection to what the loved ones would want, because staff don't quite know whether they should approach or not. Will there be a memorial or not? How much should they join in? So it's really important to make that connection and check in to see what that need is. Of course, Emma talked about where is the support. It's a good idea, I think, in advance of anything like this happening, to have a centralised map of support available that's off the shelf, actually. So your local assistance programmes, obviously that looks different wherever you are in the UK, but making sure that they know and that they're in reaching and it's widely available. And importantly, it's important to recognise that the list of the colleagues closest might need that extra in reach and that more assertive support. But it's really important to know that actually anyone can find this triggering, so that it shouldn't just be targeted support, it should be that general support available to all. And next slide. And of course, the supporters, the people holding, they need holding too. So make sure that those line managers are looked after. When you hear Sarah and Emma's experience, they needed looking after too. And think about different spaces in which colleagues might like to express and be listened to. So some of it is about memorial, some of it is about reflective spaces. Some people prefer just to chat in the corridor or coffee room. Some people do not wish to speak. So we do need to offer that space for memorial and celebration, and think about that connection in terms of what the family want. And of course, as Emma referred to, we have to really sensitively think about the reallocation of work and the work keeping going, and also sensitively managing the belongings of the colleague. And then finally, it's not just a one-stop shop. It's really worth that check-in 3 months and 6 months later to check in to see how colleagues are. Next slide. So we're at the end. Sorry for the delayed start. If we could close down the slides, and Emma, if you could put on your video. Emma is joining us for a Q&A, so I can see that we've already got 3 questions, or 1 comment and a question. So thank you for the first person.
Tom shortlisted and I shortlisted.
Julie, I'm sorry, it won't let me put my camera on. It says the host has blocked it.
Okay, don't worry. Our support will sort that out in the background. Okay. So, so thank you for the first comment from someone. So I'll just read it out. So I experienced this working in Bristol, where a new junior doctor initially went missing. Straight away, the other doctors knew they would have committed suicide, and it seems something that they just accepted that happens sometimes. We were not offered help until it was confirmed by the police that this is potentially the most likely outcome due to all the evidence. It was a really strange situation. I felt we could have done more if our other colleagues felt the person was struggling. It I felt it made it more into just one of those things that happens sometimes. There's a really important comment there about it's almost just accepted. And the next comment really relates to this as a question. So do we think that there should be a requirement for those who lead teams or manage people to be trained and supported on how to deal on this rather than waiting until they're in this situation? Absolutely. Absolutely, I would agree. Emma, do you think for you it would have made a difference if you'd have had some training beforehand?
Yes, I think so. If I'm honest, I think I'd have just felt a little bit more prepared. Not that you can ever be prepared for an outcome like this, but I think I'd have just gone in with a little bit more knowledge, which would have maybe given a little bit more confidence at times. But I think it's still, even if I was to do it again, and I hope I never have to, but I think it's still, you'll learn new things each time, but at least you can take your previous experiences with you. So yeah, but things like the toolkit, you know, genuinely that will make a big difference, I hope.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And then a third question. So 3 of my ICU consultant colleagues have died by suicide. My goodness. The memorial service for one of them is today. Wow. We have tried very hard to make changes to protect our staff, but are very short-staffed and on our knees. I think many people can relate to that in ICU and the NHS right now. How can we best get support from our trust? We have psychology, but it's on request. The exhaustion is overwhelming, both physical and psychological. We cannot get time off as our rota is held together by a thread. I mean, gosh, that's really fueling the plane while it's still in flight, isn't it? You know, you just have to keep going with that. And I think this is where having that senior spokesperson actually perhaps speaking out to beyond the intensive care and actually noticing, gosh, this isn't just like the first comment, this isn't just one of those things. Actually, this is something that's affecting all of us, and we're particularly struggling with this. I think it's really important to reach out. I would also say, you know, we've got this toolkit now. Please take this to your teams, use what you can of it, but also use it as a communication tool. One of the things that happened to me is my husband is a psychologist too. And while I was writing this document with the team, what happened was in his trust, he had a suicide. And actually he works with someone from the association who sent him a draft of our document. And considering we were both psychologists, what we said was it was just so helpful to have. So I wonder about connecting with those psychologists and giving them this tool, just not to tell them what to do, but as a guide to say, this is what has helped others. So we lost Emma there for a second, but she's back. I'm just aware of time, so we'll just take the few more comments that have been made. So the family details may not be known if the junior doctor is transient member of the team. This is sad in itself. I think, gosh, yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point to make. And I think this is the nature of temporary workers, you know, new workers, rotational workers, but it's also the nature of intensive care, isn't it? If we're properly staffed, we're 10 people per bed, which is just enormous, really. And how do we make those social connections with each other? So I think if there's one thing I would suggest today, I would say go out there and get to know your teams. Is there guidance on how to support a team when a colleague attempts suicide and becomes a patient? Gosh, I mean, that is a really difficult one, because obviously the patient, the colleague could become an intensive care patient. I guess there isn't guidance on that specifically around suicide, but I've had personal experience of colleagues or links to colleagues from the hospital rather than from intensive care coming in to ICU. And I think we have to think confidentiality through and through. This is where we have to be really careful of that balance of what the staff need in that curiosity. And actually, if they're a patient on intensive care, then actually the situation's still uncertain, and they cannot consent, and the family may not be in a position to consent to share that wider. So I think usual patient confidentiality is an important part of that. Emma, do you have any further thoughts on that one, because that's a really tricky area?
I mean, it's fairly horrific, isn't it? We've had, I mean, I guess we've probably all experienced having staff as patients in some capacity before, and to some extent, I guess you have to go into work mode, and you carry on treating them like a patient, and almost the management of feelings happens outside of the ward and the unit, and it's almost a separate discussion. So I think the way I'd probably approach it with teams is that you almost have to have two hats on. And I think in those early days, that is how you have to manage it, because business does have to carry on, unfortunately. But then that can help some people from a coping mechanism, because there is that routine too. Julie, is it okay just to go back to the comment stroke question from somebody who obviously has the memorial service today? I mean, that's just awful. And, you know, I'm so sorry that you are having to go through that. But I guess for me, we obviously experienced the same thing, because I couldn't clear out the physiotherapy department. Luckily, some staff weren't aware of our colleagues, so they were very happy to stay in the hospital and move teams. So, you know, all teams are equally covered. But our chaplains and team, if that's the right word, was absolutely amazing, and did put on a service type thing for us, and created an area within our special, there's a special room that's non-religious upstairs, so anybody from any religious background can go there, or if you're from non-religion background too. And they created a space, and also just talking opportunities, and almost like a little service outside of those times that was repeated. So I really would recommend just seeing if anybody would be available to do something like that for you, because colleagues found it really helpful. But also those colleagues that didn't feel that they mentally could go to the actual memorial service, this was a lovely alternative option for them. So I really hope you get something sorted.
Fabulous, thank you, Emma. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to kind of acknowledge some of the other comments that have come in rather than questions. I think someone said, should we start training and openness early? Absolutely agreed. We have a psychologist who's been through this experience and is thanking us for this work, and there's a person who's attending who's thanking both yourself, Emma, and Sarah, for the incredible work that you did in supporting your colleagues. And I think a really lovely line to pull out is, learning by doing is not okay here. And people reflecting on their experiences of having to look after or not look after a colleague who becomes a patient, and a comment of thanking us about reducing stigma and raising this area. So thank you, just to acknowledge all of those really useful comments there. We started a little late, apologies, but we shall wrap up now. What I'm just going to do is, I'm just going to cut and paste for you a survey about the webinar today. If you have time, if you're able to give us your feedback, but also any useful kind of comments or suggestions for further work that we could do. I think there's something there about when a colleague becomes a patient, actually, that I'll make a note of and think about in the work of the Thriving at Work programme and the Society. So thank you for that. I think it's really important for me to thank Emma. Sorry about your camera, but we got to see your video, and just thank Sarah for both of you for sharing your stories and influencing the document. I want to thank the association and FICM and our wider working group for all the work that they've done to pull this together. The document and the recording of today's webinar will be available next week on our website, the Intensive Care Society website. Out of respect to Her Majesty, we're not posting on social media over the next few days, so look at social media from Monday. Thank you to everyone who joined with us today.